I think one of the biggest misconceptions about awakening is that once you've seen through your old patterns, understood what shaped you, then the healing part is somehow done. You can see your childhood. You understand now why you learned to people please, why abandonment hits you so deeply, why certain things affect you way more than they should, and even why you end up in the same kind of relationships. And there can be this enormous sense of relief, accomplishment even, in finally being able to explain it all to yourself. And then life touches you exactly the same place again, and somehow your body still reacts as if none of that understanding ever happened. So why are you suddenly exhausted, emotional, pulled inward, and flooded with all of those things that you thought that you had already dealt with? And it feels less like healing and more like falling apart, as if you're suspended between two worlds, no longer fully belonging to the old one, but unable to see what comes next. So what exactly is happening? I think this is exactly where a lot of conversations about healing and awakening stop. We understand what happened, we uncover the patterns, we do the shadow work, and then somehow we're expected to jump back to participating in this world as this new, more conscious version of ourselves. But there is an entire process in between that hardly anyone talks about, which is inner integration. Shadow work can help us understand what was suppressed, hidden, or rejected within ourselves. It can help us see where certain patterns came from and why we learn certain strategies in the first place. But understanding those strategies doesn't automatically make the nervous system stop using them. You can know exactly why you're reacting and still be unable to stop the reaction. Your mind may know what happened years ago, but your body is still reacting to the old prediction. But healing is not about acquiring better and more detailed explanation of what happened. Sometimes becoming extremely good at explaining the wound can just become another way of controlling it. Keeping it at a safe distance as something that we understand, rather than something that we have actually allowed ourselves to feel. And at some point, the system just has to catch up to what the mind already knows. And I think many of us stay in that gap much longer than we realize. I know I have. When this started happening to me, I had no idea what was going on because I genuinely thought that I had already done a lot of the work. Over the previous few years, I had already left old habits, identities, and ways of living behind. I rebuilt large parts of my life and felt far more aligned than I had before. So when I started feeling exhausted all of the time, when I lost interest in everything and started craving solitude again, and being pulled into these intensely reflective and emotionally charged states, my first thought was, why is all of this coming back now? And this is the part that makes integration so confusing, because it does not necessarily arrive when your life looks obviously broken. In fact, it usually happens when you already understood a lot about yourself, made changes, and thought that the most difficult part was behind you. And it may feel like nothing particularly dramatic is happening in the present, but something in you just suddenly feels ancient. The best I can describe this feeling is as if you're being pulled inward or underwater. Memories that you have not consciously thought about for years may suddenly appear. And sometimes there isn't even a clear memory attached to what you're feeling. There is just this grief, pressure somewhere in the body, and this strange emotional weight that feels much older than whatever happened that day. I wasn't intentionally sitting there trying to analyze my own life. If anything, it felt the opposite. Old memories and feelings started coming in waves almost uncontrollably, as though the floor underneath me had broken open and everything that I had kept underneath it for so long finally started coming through. And some of what comes up can feel so unbearably raw that it feels like someone is putting out a cigarette on the most tender part of your heart. I know it may sound dramatic until you experience a feeling that old without all of the protective layers that you have built around it. And this is when I started seeing the difference between understanding why something happened and actually integrating it through your body. Because we can trace a reaction all the way back to its origin and know exactly why we have it. But understanding why the pain is there does not mean that it has finished moving through us. What couldn't be fully felt when it happened may have been suppressed, rationalized, or simply pushed aside because surviving the situation came first. But once there is more safety, some of these unfinished things can return to awareness, not only as thoughts or memories, but also through the body as grief, tears, sensations, and also exhaustion, because your system is doing an enormous amount of work internally, processing and reorganizing what had been held there for years or even decades. So, feeling something heavy again does not automatically mean that you've gone backwards. Sometimes it means that you finally have enough capacity to meet something that you once had to avoid. And meeting it is very different from drowning in it. Integration isn't endlessly reliving old pain. It's being able to remain present while an old emotional reality becomes conscious without immediately having to suppress it, act it out, rationalize it, or let it decide what happens next. The feeling can exist, and you can exist too. So instead of asking, how do I make this feeling go away? I think the question becomes, can I stay here long enough to discover what happens if I don't immediately run away from it? And I did want to run very badly. The moment some of these things started coming to the surface, my mind became incredibly creative about finding something to do or somewhere to be. I thought about joining more church or tennis groups, working harder, going on more hikes, starting to build my own app, moving to a new apartment, or helping someone solve their problems instead of sitting there and dwelling on my own. And I want to say that none of those things are bad, okay? Until you start paying attention to the timing, though. Does this sudden urge to reorganize your entire life appear when sitting still becomes emotionally uncomfortable? Because sometimes what looks like ambition, productivity, being social, or even spirituality is also what allows us to avoid to sit with ourselves. It gives us somewhere to go so that we don't have to stay where we are. And you don't have to admit that you're running or avoiding if everybody, yourself included, is congratulating you for being productive while you do it. You see, sometimes this sudden urge or desire to do something immediately is not movement toward life, but just another way of running away from it. And that made me wonder if sometimes we don't deliberately go looking for what we've buried. It finds us when we finally run out of places to hide from it. But what happens when none of those exits work anymore? When all those things that you normally use to redirect your attention are suddenly no longer available? That's what happened to me. It felt as though I was being cornered into stillness. I was no longer working full-time. Some of my close friends had left the island, and other connections have naturally fallen away. There was no new job or project to immediately occupy all of my attention, so my life became strangely empty. There was nowhere to run and nothing to distract myself with, just the void. And your version of the void may look completely different, though. It may still happen in a full life. So circumstances may differ, but the usual common feature is that the usual ways you escape yourself either stop giving you the same relief or become unavailable. And for me, it was the latter this time. And at first, I resisted it. I was kicking and screaming. Because when you're so used to external world and movement regulating your internal world, this emptiness does not immediately feel peaceful. It can actually feel pretty unbearable. All the usual noise just disappears, and you can finally discover how much it had actually been protecting you from hearing. And that's when you can find yourself sitting in this horrible emotional soup of grief mixed with memories, fear, the thing that you can't explain and cannot. And there is no clear ending to any of this. And maybe for the first time in your life, you cannot convert your discomfort into another project or achievement quickly enough to escape it. You just have to be there long enough to stop interrupting every feeling the moment it becomes uncomfortable. There is this narrative in spiritual communities that if you don't feel like yourself anymore, if your life is collapsing, people are leaving, the job disappears, and congrats, your breakthrough is coming. You know, your timeline is shifting and your new life is arriving. Just endure and don't forget to get excited. But almost no one explains what exactly is coming apart and why. You see, the beginning of shadow work can look externally dramatic. Relationships and identities collapse, and the entire external structures of your life may stop working. But as the work moves deeper into integration, it can feel just as destabilizing, but much of the collapse is happening internally this time. So your life may look relatively uneventful from the outside, while your entire internal structure, including your old defenses, identities, and ways of protecting yourself, is being dismantled and reorganized underneath it. And I think that's where many of us mistaken that for nothing happening, while in reality, almost everything is happening somewhere no one can see. The truth is, a lot of space is required for something that had been running unconsciously to finally become visible, and also for us to be able to stay with that internal dismantling instead of immediately escaping it. And sometimes even another external collapse may take place, especially if we were unwilling or unable to choose that stillness for ourselves, making avoidance almost impossible. Like there is nowhere to run. And in that absence, the unconscious finally comes to the surface and meets the conscious, maybe even for the first time. And some of these discoveries can be brutal. You may have seen yourself as this deeply empathetic, warm human being, always emotionally available for others. And then there comes the shadow and says, yes, you were there for others, but also deeply absent and avoidant of yourself. Or you may have judged others for being inconsistent with you. And then comes the shadow and says, actually, you were not consistent with yourself either. You ignored your own needs, broke promises to yourself, and demanded from others what you repeatedly failed to give yourself. But seeing those contradictions is only the beginning, because once what was unconscious becomes conscious, integration asks us to bring all those conflicting and split off parts back into the relationship with the whole. Think of it as reassembly, and this is where the transformation of the caterpillar into a butterfly becomes such a powerful metaphor for me, because if you think about it, inside the chrysalis, caterpillar does not simply become a better and improved version of what it already was. Its old form starts dissolving into this literal soup, while its body starts reorganizing into something completely new. It essentially mirrors the dissolution of the old self, dismantling the old identity and the old organization that can no longer hold who we are becoming. And then comes the precision rebuilding, when the old material is not simply discarded, but is used as a part of the raw material from which the new form is built. And I think something similar happens with us. Integration doesn't mean fully discarding our past pain, trauma, or conflicting parts. It's just the reassembly of the parts that had been fragmented, the experiences that we could not process at a time, or the things that we had to suppress, or even the adaptations that once kept us safe back into a whole. So the same soup that initially feels like complete disintegration becomes the raw energy to build the whole and undivided psyche. And maybe that is why this process can feel so confusing and disorienting, especially in the middle of it, because the old organization of yourself is already breaking down while the new one has not fully taken shape yet. So the caterpillar isn't there anymore, but the butterfly isn't there yet. And that void isn't simply the empty space between the life that fell apart and the new one that everyone else keeps promising is coming. Some of the most important work is actually taking place inside that space. What makes the experience so bizarre is that coexistence of feeling exhausted and internally dismantled, and simultaneously experiencing this unusual clarity, connection, and softness and meaning. It literally feels like you've been unplugged from the outlet and then plugged back in. The whole system is resetting and coming back online again. but differently this time. Long before we had any modern psychological language for any of this, spiritual traditions were already paying attention to what can happen in periods of withdrawal, solitude, and waiting. In the Bible, the major transitions repeatedly pass through the wilderness, the period when the ordinary life falls apart before something new begins. Jesus enters the wilderness before the public ministry we all know him for even starts, before all the miracles and teachings and crowds. There is this period of solitude when he's alone and fasting and being tempted and confronting what he encounters there. And then there is Jacob, left alone at the Jabbok before crossing into the next part of his life. He wrestles through the night and comes out of it changed, with a new name and even a different way of walking. And I don't read those stories as some ancient neuroscience. What interests me personally is the pattern that they preserve. And I think those stories point towards something that human beings have recognized for a long time, that sometimes withdrawal precedes reorientation. Before we can hear what life is asking of us next, we have to become quiet and still enough to notice how much of our current movement came from fear, identity, expectations, or simply the terror of having nowhere to go. And I think that's why a genuine transition can sometimes feel like losing your own life. The old ways of organizing yourself just stop working before you know what will replace them. You're no longer fully living inside your old identity, but you have not yet stabilized inside whatever is emerging next. You're basically walking between two worlds, and in that space, there is very little to perform. There may be nobody to impress and nothing obvious to achieve. There is even no confirmation if any of this has any meaning at all. You simply become finally available to what you have been carrying all this time. And that new availability can be exactly what allows deeper integration to finally begin. Old suppressed material can finally start coming to the surface when the nervous system feels more safe. And this is exactly why the whole thing can feel so unexpected and catch us off guard, because it finds us when we're not actively trying to process anything. When we stop trying so hard and finally relax. And that's what kept surprising me. I'd go for a walk without thinking about anything, and then suddenly I would understand why something that happened 10 years ago had affected me the way it did. Or I'd eat, become tired, and let myself take a nap instead of forcing productivity. And something emotional would surface as soon as my body softened. Or sometimes I would spend hours trying to understand something and get absolutely nowhere. And the moment I stopped trying, the missing connection would appear on its own later. As someone who saw relaxation as the opposite of work, I was genuinely mind blown. Turns out sometimes relaxation is what makes the work possible, because there are certain things that we cannot simply force into awareness. We can create the conditions, we can become available and pay attention, but some processes seem to have their own timing. And until then, I personally mostly trusted what I could produce through effort. And integration pushed me into something that I had very little experience with, which is receptivity. Being able to relax and wait for the right time to receive. And if you're someone who had always trusted effort, receptivity can feel almost irresponsible at first. I know it felt that way for me. If I'm being completely honest, I always resisted the idea of total surrender and being versus doing, because being had never paid the bills. Doing had, and my mind had decades of evidence of that. So the idea of just relaxing and somehow allowing life to meet you sounded nice spiritually, but kind of questionable practically. So when I felt that pull to stop frantically trying to secure the next job and become available to what was already emerging, including that unexpected pull to start creating videos, my mind was horrified. It basically went on strike and just refused to give away control, saying how irresponsible and insane it was, creating those apocalyptic scenarios of me ending up homeless and sleeping in the park. And none of that happened. I mean, at least not yet. I'm gonna knock on wood. And we do this all the time. something in us quietly knows the next step, and before we've even taken it, the mind has already turned it into a catastrophe. And I started understanding that surrender is not about becoming passive. It's not what it is asking of us. It changes our relationship to action itself. It's the willingness to stop controlling a process long enough to participate in what is actually happening already. And then I started noticing this shift everywhere. For example, I do not really sit at my desk brainstorming video ideas. They usually find me when I'm doing something completely unrelated or nothing at all. I'll be in yoga and suddenly a sentence appears in my mind that connects three things that I've been thinking about for months. And I'm lying in Shavasana trying to keep it in my mind until I get a chance to get to my phone and type it up. Or I'll have to step out from the shower because something suddenly makes sense. And I know I will lose it if I do not write it down. So I was not trying to come up with anything. I was simply available because receptivity works in both directions. Integration doesn't only change what we can finally release, but it also changes our capacity to receive. And we tend to think that creativity mostly originates entirely within ourselves. But I don't think that everything that we receive comes from the conscious mind only. I think that insights, ideas, and even guidance can come from somewhere deeper, the unconscious, the collective, the spiritual, and become finally available to us when we become still enough to receive it. And this is the other function of emptiness. What creates space for something old to leave also creates space for something new to enter. We cannot actively receive something when every part of us is still preoccupied with worrying, obsessing, and controlling what comes next. The vessel needs to become empty enough so that something can finally move through it. And I mean, don't get me wrong, action, effort, and strategy, they all matter. An idea will not magically turn itself into a finished video. But the difference is that effort comes only after something became clear, rather than used to force clarity in the first place. And I think that's an important distinction because what looks like action can still be reaction driven by fear, avoidance, the need to prove something or escape. And a more conscious kind of action becomes available when we become still enough to perceive what is actually happening. Stillness creates that space that allows us to notice what is asking for our participation right now. And I think this is where integration becomes much bigger than just emotional regulation, because our wounds do not only affect how we feel, it also affects how we participate. If we need approval badly enough, it eventually influences what we're willing to say. If abandonment feels unbearable, it changes what we're willing to tolerate to keep someone or something. Or if conflict registers as danger, we can spend years calling compliance peace. And if our self-worth is based on usefulness, then we can spend years calling self-erasure generosity. And these do not remain just private psychological patterns. They follow us into our families, communities, and workplaces, and eventually into the parts of the world that we help shape. And I think that's ultimately what integration can teach us. Healing asks us to look backward for a while because we need to understand what happened to us, to see how it affected us and what we built around it. But we're not meant to spend the rest of our lives facing backward. Without integration, those adaptations can keep running on autopilot long after the original danger is gone. And we can understand all of this intellectually, but embodiment eventually asks us to become what we have understood. And integration creates space between what happened to us and what we consciously transmit into the future. And our past does not become less real because of that. It stops having the same authority over what happens next. I think this is where healing stops being only this continuous project of self-improvement and self-repair and becomes the question of stewardship, because the point of healing has never been endlessly excavating ourselves until we remove every single wound. I think the goal has always been to become free enough so that our wounds do not get to consume everything passing through us. So what are we going to do with the capacity that's been returned to us? Some of that reclaimed capacity can go toward truth, love, service, creation, a deeper relationship with God, towards something that can actually move beyond us. That's where the individual work meets the collective, because none of us move through this world without participating in what this world becomes. And now that more of our lives is finally ours to leave, what are we going to do with this life that is finally available to us? What are we going to participate in next?